Well, welcome everyone. I'm Jim Goldgeier. I'm a Robert Bosch Senior Visiting Fellow at the Brookings Institution and a Professor of International Relations at American University. And I'm also co-director of Bridging the Gap, which is supported by Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Frankel Family Foundation. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this webinar on what to do when your research gets disrupted. And in spite of research getting disrupted, I'm wishing you all the best for this challenging academic year and hope that this will help at least on the research side amidst all the other things that are going on. For those who don't know Bridging the Gap, we provide training and support for scholars who want to engage public and policy audiences. And Bridging the Gap is sponsoring this webinar. Recordings from our earlier webinars can be found on our website at www.bridgingthegapproject.org. Our next webinar will be September 22nd, book launch for Dave Barno and Nora Bensahel's adaptation Under Fire, which is the latest release in our Oxford University Press Bridging the Gap book series. I'm going to introduce our speakers and then dive into the conversation, and Catherine Urban will be monitoring the questions that are coming to the panel. So feel free to submit those via either the chat or Q&A functions. And we'll acknowledge you by name if we're able to address your question, unless you note that you would prefer to remain anonymous. The conversation is being recorded and will be made available for viewing at the Bridging the Gap website. While we hope this is useful for scholars at any stage of career, we had in mind three groups when we set this up. First of all, PhD students who are at the prospectus stage and might be rethinking their topics given research limitations due to COVID-19. PhD students who are well into the dissertations, had expected to do more field work, archival research, but are now grounded. And junior faculty who are eyeing the tenure clock and whose research has been disrupted by the pandemic. There may be other categories for whom this is useful, and we hope it is, but those are who we had in mind. And so we put together a panel with that in mind, and I'll just introduce them briefly in alphabetical order. Susanna Campbell, Assistant Professor at the School of International Service and Director of the Research on International Policy Implementation Lab, Ripple, at American University. Catherine Herrold, Associate Professor at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and a faculty affiliate of the Indiana University Paul H. O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. Paul Staniland, Associate Professor of Political Science, Faculty Chair of the Committee on International Relations, and Co-Director of the Program on International Security Policy and Program on Political Violence at the University of Chicago. Jelena Subotic, Professor in the Department of Political Science at Georgia State University, and Kelebogile Zvobgo, a PhD candidate in Political Science and International Relations at the University of Southern California, and a predoctoral fellow at the Global Research Institute and founder and director of the International Justice Lab at William & Mary, where she will start as an assistant professor in 2021. Katie, we'll start with you, since your work is a reminder that research can get disrupted even when there is no pandemic. We were thrilled to publish your book, Delta Democracy, in our Bridging the Gap book series with OUP. And I know your field work in Egypt was affected by events there from 2011 onwards. And so given your deep experience with disruption, can you talk about how you've dealt with that as a scholar doing field work?
Absolutely, Jim. Thank you for having me here today. It's a real honor to be part of this panel. To give the viewers just a quick bit of background, that book project began as a PhD dissertation, and ultimately it turned out to be about how local non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, in Egypt understood and promoted the concept of democracy. And I conducted the pilot research for that project in 2010. I was finalizing my dissertation proposal when the Arab Spring uprisings broke out. And with my advisor's permission, I scrapped that proposal and I flew to the region during Egypt's 18 days of protests. I flew to Jordan, and then I got to Egypt shortly thereafter, shortly after Mubarak fell. And obviously, the uprisings significantly altered that research project, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But the pandemic, the current coronavirus pandemic, is also impacting my current field-based research in Palestine, where I study the rise of voluntary grassroots organizations. I was supposed to be there right now, and obviously I'm not. So let me talk briefly about how I approached research during both of those disruptions. And I want to focus on the concept of risk. And as you'll hear, that concept is played out very differently in my two projects. So in Egypt, I took a variety of risks that wound up working out pretty well. First, the most obvious risk, I flew into a revolution. I had no idea how and where protests would continue to unfold and what the security situation would be like. And I also didn't know if I would have access to the NGOs that I was hoping to study, given the political turmoil. So I really didn't know if the project was feasible in the first place. The second risk I took is that I had to scrap my research plans due to the very changed circumstances on the ground. As I said, I started my research when Mubarak was still in power and continued after the Arab Spring uprisings in a drastically altered landscape. So I changed my research question. I threw out my theoretical framework. I abandoned any hope of a coherent sampling strategy. And I was also partially constrained in my geographic scope due to security concerns. So in sum, I had a compass for that research, but I didn't have a map. I knew essentially where I wanted to get to, but I didn't know what route I was going to take. And for a PhD student, that's a pretty big risk. Now, a third risk concerned my timeline. I took on what was a fairly big question and project during a time of major political turmoil. And as a result, I had to spend quite a bit of time in the field. Meeting plans constantly changed, protests interrupted my travel possibilities, and most importantly, as the situation evolved, so too did the nature of my questions and my understanding of my findings. So I stayed in the field for nearly 2 years after Mubarak fell, and also returned multiple times through 2017. And the evolving political situation not only affected my research, but also my publishing timeline. I waited until after 2017 to start writing my book because I wanted to make sure that what I was arguing was still valid after all of the changes that had taken place in the 6 years. The most important risk and the most impactful risk that I took was the risk to my interlocutors. I took extensive steps to ensure their safety. I veiled electronic communications. I often met with my interlocutors off-site, away from their NGOs. I guaranteed confidentiality and anonymity, but the types of questions I was asking were quite sensitive, and so there was certainly a risk to them, and I was very clear with them about that risk. Now, most of those risks in Egypt were to my personal safety. As I said, the most impactful one was to my interlocutors, but many of the others were to my personal safety. And I felt comfortable taking the risks, and they wound up working out okay. But in Palestine, the situation is very different. Like in Egypt, my research is ethnographic in nature. And even without the travel bans, I couldn't ethically conduct field research in the middle of a pandemic. The risk to my study participants would be just too great. So that project is on hold. I'm conducting some research remotely through social media, and I hope we might have a discussion about the use of social media or online tools for conducting research during a pandemic. But that's about the extent of what I can do at this point due to issues of trust within the research in Palestine specifically. So let me stop there, but provide just a couple of key takeaways based on my experience. First, adapting research to a major disruption can involve significant risk. And at the end of the day, it's really up to the researcher to decide, based on personal comfort level, the nature of the research, and most importantly, the ethics surrounding treatment of study participants, whether or not to take those risks. But often taking risks involves breaking some of the rules or the unwritten rules of academia, whether those are rules that guide doctoral work, life on the tenure track, or even life as a tenured professor. And so perhaps breaking some of those rules will ultimately bring about some welcome changes to the culture of academia. But that is a topic for a much longer discussion. And I hope that for now, hearing my own approach to fieldwork in the midst of two different disruptions can in some ways be useful. And I very much look forward to hearing from the rest of the panelists and to our ensuing conversation with all of the audience members.
Great, thanks so much, Katie, for getting us started here. And Kelly, I want to turn to you next. You're the earliest career scholar on this panel, and you've already had so much success with your impressive appointments and publications, and congratulations on getting a draft of the dissertation done this summer. I know you've done interviews, you've done focus groups, and so curious how the pandemic is affecting your planning as you look out into the near future with completing the dissertation and then moving on to publications off of it and getting your faculty career started.
Great. Thanks so much, Jim, and to all the folks at Bridging the Gap for the invitation to participate on this panel. I feel like I have some things to say, but also that I will be learning a lot from everyone else. So really excited to be part of this conversation. So I'm fortunate to have completed much of my planned fieldwork prior to the pandemic, and some of it almost by a hair. I had gone to Guatemala for a couple weeks of field research with one of my students, and we are on the flight back home to Virginia. And this was, I think, March 16th. So the university had just closed on March 13th, the Friday before. And we're in our regularly scheduled Delta flight. And we hear, as we're pulling out, you know, they do the little exits, etc. And they say, this will be the last flight from Guatemala to the United States for a while. And, you know, just imagine my horror, but also relief in ending up on the last flight, my normally scheduled flight. It wasn't like we were like running through, you know, what they're trying to get to the airport to like make it to America. Nothing like that. So yeah, that was wild. I'm glad I was able to return someone's child to them, and also that I could be back home. Anyway, so I'm currently working on a book-length, book-style dissertation called Governing Truth, NGOs and the Politics of Transitional Justice, in which I develop and test a theory about how transnational civil society actors govern the norm and practice of transitional justice, specifically by driving the creation of its constituent mechanisms, their design, and implementation and follow-up. And so opening up this area of work with an institutional focus on truth commissions and leverage a series of novel data sets that I call the varieties of truth commissions. But within this project, I also leverage, like Jim said, interviews and focus groups with various domestic and international civil society actors, including officials from previous truth commissions, as well as current and former staff at a range of NGOs, including INGOs like Amnesty International and the International Center for Transitional Justice, and of course, domestic groups. And so in terms of domestic groups, I'd managed to do a focus group with human rights advocates from Argentina last fall, and then with human rights advocates from Guatemala in Guatemala this last spring. I was hoping this summer to go to South Africa and Timor-Leste, so my plans were to be there in May and July, and of course that didn't happen, which was the subject of much consternation, as I'm sure it is for a lot of other folks. And so after, you know, having my, you know, my pity party, which I think we all merit, we all deserve to, you know, be upset about what's happened, but then kind of to get a great to create a game plan, I decided actually, similar to Katie for her second project, to put a pause on this research. One, because I just did not want to undertake the risks of travel for myself, but in some ways, most importantly for my interlocutors. They are human rights defenders. They have, already a lot on their plate in the best of times, let alone during a pandemic when they're trying to see to the defense of rights of, for example, people who are incarcerated or who are detained, et cetera. And so just, in terms of just like, what was proper and fitting for the time, it just didn't make sense. Also, really mindful of being a scholar in the global north, I wasn't going to be a disease vector and, take COVID-19 to the global south. That is a huge, huge, huge ethical concern. I think a lot of field work can be extractive in nature and not always contribute to local people. And, the opportunity to contribute disease was not something I wanted to participate in either. There was the option, or at least suggestion by colleagues to do interviews and focus groups virtually, which is certainly an option that you may wish to pursue, again, depending on where you are in terms of your research and what you need to defend, right? And so I think we're all making adjustments. We're all gonna have a little bit less than perfect, right? So figuring out with your committee, if you're a grad student, what you need to defend versus, what you want for the first draft of your book manuscript, or what you want to have at your manuscript review workshop, right? So I opted against virtual interviews and focus groups, just putting a pause on the research. One, for the ethical and health considerations that I've raised already, but also because I had concerns about the nature and quality of the responses and of the conversations that I was going to have, just that I wouldn't get the same degree of answers, the same rapport building, familiarity, I feel like when we're on here on Zoom or on Skype, it's like, okay, let me get in and get out, when I would go to the headquarters of a given group in Guatemala, I, had technically asked for, half an hour to 45 minutes. And here we are, hour 3, and like they're bringing out the tea still, And so you want to be able to have those kinds of interactions. And I just don't see anyone wanting to be on Skype with me for 3 hours. I don't want to be on Skype for 3 hours, let alone to replicate that however many times. Also snowballing and some of these fortuitous and serendipitous encounters. For the people who haven't done field work and you're feeling like I will never be able to do field work because you can do a lot in a little bit of time. In 2 weeks, I think I did 24 interviews with representatives from the major human rights NGOs in Guatemala, but I only had 8 of those planned, right? I had cold emailed everyone under the sun and I'd only gotten 8 responses, and people were telling me, oh my gosh, that's so many. And I was like, it's not enough, because this is my first time doing field work in the field. Other times, it's been at conferences where I've been able to then meet with, these particular civil society representatives, or I've gone to their international headquarters, which are in the US, right? Or the Argentine advocates were up in DC, so I interviewed them there. So this was my first time, and I wanted to make sure I was being a good steward of the resources that I had, the limited resources that I had. And it'll just balloon, but I would be in an interview and I would say, do you know anyone at the Human Rights Ombudsman's office? And, one WhatsApp later, they're like, can you make 9 a.m. tomorrow? And so just like the speed and the pace of what's possible in terms of sampling and meeting people and getting quality responses and answers and conversations, I didn't think could be accomplished virtually either. So I guess to close out, some suggestions. So one thing to consider is, what can you only get in the field and what would you like to get in the field, right? So there are some archives that are digitized, right? There are scholars in our field who have gone before, who have been to Guatemala studying transitional justice and Timor-Leste and, and the Gambia and everywhere else. And so are there materials that you can get in advance and begin working with in anticipation of then incorporating interview and focus group data at a later point when it's safe to do so. And then what can you only get in the field? So being able to make that delineation and do the most with what you have while you're at home. And one of those is being very clear about the observable implications of your theory, right? And so basically having written and ready to just insert lines, like essentially, you know, what interview or focus group or ethnographic data would provide evidence for my theory, right? Essentially, if I am right, I will see this. If I am wrong, because falsifiability is important, I will see this, right? And just being very, very clear about that so that when you go and see, you can be integrating quickly. Just offering some alternatives. I'm not doing these myself, but there are things that I've discussed with colleagues, and that's the possibility of surveys. So you might actually be able to sample people, let's say, you know, human rights advocates from, you know, more countries, right? Because you're not going to all those places. And so you could email, and I'm not sure what response rates are going to be at this time, but that's certainly one option. It's actually a low cost option, right? Because fieldwork is expensive. And so maybe we should be talking also about the opportunities of having to, you know, to retool and rethink. Also, I don't know if this is true, but this is something that my friends and I were floating around, that elites might actually be more available now, and actually maybe Skype or Zoom is the way to get to them in a way that during normal times they're, you know, too busy, you know, traveling and doing all these things. Guess what? They're all stuck at home too. And so that actually might be an opportunity to get a different set of actors if you're not already engaging government elites and policymakers who might be able to contribute to your project now.
Great, thanks so much, Kelly. And yes, you know, I've heard from a number of folks, and I just think back to my own work doing elite interviews and how hard it usually is to get on somebody's schedule, and, you know, they're traveling, and now they're not traveling and they've got plenty of free time. And I have heard certainly from a number of scholars who've been able to get a lot of interviews done that they otherwise wouldn't have been able to. But you just make that great point about what you gain from that in-person interaction and where it can take you. And there are things about it that aren't the same as doing it over Zoom or Skype. But you know, you've got to work with what you have. So Jelena, first of all, congratulations on the multiple awards that your book Yellow Star, Red Star, Holocaust Remembrance After Communism has received. It's just fantastic to see the notice that you've gotten. Kelly mentioned archives and digitizing. You've used archives. What is your advice for students who were, or any other scholars who were setting up projects where they were planning on visiting repositories for research? I know just from working on US foreign policy that the Schaefer Task Force on online research has put up a website for scholars of US foreign policy. And I know there are other guides to digital archives, but what advice do you have for those who are planning to work with those kind of primary documents?
Thank you, Jim. And again, I'm very happy to be here and speak to whatever little pieces of advice I can convey. I want to say a couple of things. Some of them have already been mentioned that I may want to just amplify. The first thing I want to begin with is that this has happened before. Not COVID-19, but interruption in fieldwork has happened before and has happened to most of us in some form or another. War, disease, personal health, other personal reasons, institutions collapse, universities collapse, funding gets pulled out. There are many, many reasons to have interrupted research. So for people who are, especially for junior scholars or PhD students who are now dealing with this and may think that this is just the absolute disaster, that it's going to ruin everything. It's very, very difficult. I don't want to minimize it, but it's not the first time that people are facing real difficulty with the flow of research. In my case, I can just say a few things before I go into advice. I've not had to interrupt my research for these kinds of reasons, but I did have unexpected setbacks in getting access to archives, because I was using archival research for, and some other things also for my latest book. And that is, for political reasons, a couple of archives would not open their doors to me. And I did not anticipate that. And I've had to deal with it. I had to deal with archives saying, we're not interested in your research. We don't believe in the question you're asking. We don't trust you. And you know, I was planning on spending a couple of weeks in certain places and digging through archives, and I just was not able to. And so I had to figure out what to do and how to kind of triangulate that. I'll talk a little bit about how people can do that. But my point is that even in kind of a peacetime, without a pandemic, you can have real bizarre setbacks that you did not anticipate. So let me speak specifically to the question of archives. So as has been mentioned already, there are difficulties, obviously, when you cannot access physical archives, but many archival collections are digitized, probably more than you think. And if not all of collections, many times specific files have been digitized. So even if you cannot travel somewhere, you certainly should begin by sending a letter, an email, or fax. People still use. It's shocking but true. And really talking to people in the archives, explaining your project, explaining what you were planning on doing, and asking, is there a chance that this particular file that I've been looking for has been digitized? It's maybe not very likely, but it's certainly, you know, higher than zero that some of those things have been digitized for you. The second thing you can do is you can ask for proxies who live in those countries to go to the archives for you. I'm thinking of other graduate students or undergrads or other junior scholars that you can pay if you have funds, and people will really spend a couple of hours in the archives for not very much money. And if you can hire a PhD student or a graduate student to go tasked with what you specifically want and physically approach an archive in their city, that could really be very helpful. And people have done that, again, in peacetime, when you realize that you have forgotten something. I have done this for my book multiple times. I've abused my family members and have not paid them, but I certainly could have reached out to PhD students in other countries and asked them to go back to the archive that I just missed a particular document. So you can think about using proxies. You can also think about, again, this has been mentioned already, using a lot of secondary research. In a lot of social science, political science, we have a slightly romantic vision of what archival research is, that we're going to be the ones who are going to find that one piece of paper that nobody ever, something that's going to be pulled out of an armchair somewhere, behind the wall. But, that's kind of a big get for historians. For most of the archival type work that we do, there's a lot that has been written, or people have used different types of archival records in their own research. And it really is, especially for your dissertation, quite okay to use secondary archival research and go into secondary literature and then cite of course say that this is not what you have done as a primary source, but this is a type of research that other people have done that you can use. For example, you can think of collections of archives that are kind of secondary collections. So for example, Library of Congress has massive digital archives of other archives. And so I have used kind of the secondary, so I didn't go to Library of Congress, I used their archives through the internet, but they had some of the collections and copies of archival collections that I needed. So again, this is a secondary archival source, but it can certainly be used, and there's nothing wrong about that. The next thing you can consider doing is, again, this has been mentioned already, I think by Kelly, you can ask others. A lot of questions have been asked before, a lot of research has been done before with a different take, with a different, particular research interest, but there are many scholars who have been to your archives, who have digitized many of those archival documents that they don't need anymore, that they will be happy to share with you. In fact, I have joined just recently I'm not sure if this is new. It's new to me. Maybe this has existed for a while, but it's certainly picked up during the pandemic. An online forum for archival research where scholars are posting kind of offers of what they have for others to use. And others are asking, I am looking for a document from this archive in Berlin. Does anybody have it? And it's kind of an exchange of archival documents over the internet that's completely free. And people are just doing this because, you know, we're at home and we have time, and people realize how difficult it is not to have access. So you'd be surprised. I mean, every day I log in and there are like dozens and dozens and dozens of entries where people are either offering the collections they have or asking for particular documents. And then finally, you can get a lot from, if you're looking at not kind of a typical, let's say like a national archive, but maybe an institutional archive, kind of like in Kelly's case, a Transitional Justice Commission archive. I was also looking at some of those types of institutional archives. You'd be surprised how much you can get from their reports. So even though you may not be able to get a particular archival document, you can get a lot of information from those institutions reporting. And then you can see kind of how that's answering or not answering the question you have, and then you can reach out and maybe set up a Skype follow-up and ask, what is it in those reports? So again, even if you're not able to get the primary archival source, you can get a lot from those kinds of secondary sources. And my final point is simply that, especially for PhD students, and this is a universal advice, nothing to do with the pandemic, but in general, no dissertation is perfect. It just needs to be done. And I think all of us have, you know, very kind of romantic ideas about how, you know, ours is going to be this one piece of research that nobody's ever done before. And it's going to be, I'm going to find this like one piece of, you know, frozen in the back of a fridge manuscript that somebody was hiding for 50 years that explains everything. But it really doesn't have to be this way. And excellent dissertations and excellent books and excellent articles don't have to be perfect. And I think a lot of scholars put so much pressure on themselves that this has to be done in a particular way that they planned, that I think if you just get some of that pressure off yourself and kind of readapt and do what is possible, I think that you can see that it can be very, very good indeed. Thank you.
Yes, that's all excellent advice, and especially the point at the end about how to think about when you're ready to be done with the dissertation, working with your advisors, and leaving things for after the dissertation. I remember my mentor, one of my mentors, Professor Gail Lapidus at UC Berkeley, said to me in getting me to be done sooner rather than later, you know, this is your first big project. It's not your last project. And so you will be working on these issues for some time to come. It's time to be done with the dissertation, and then you have more work that you can do after you've gotten all the signatures on it. Susanna, first of all, congrats on the launch of the new Policy Lab. We're so excited that it's affiliated with Bridging the Gap, and really looking forward to working with you and seeing all the great things you're going to do. You've done a lot of field work in multiple conflict-affected countries. And I know, following up with some of the things that have just been said with respect to archives, I know that you've established partnerships overseas that have been important components of your work. And just wondering about past experience, but also how you're thinking about those partnerships now, given the travel restrictions.
It's very interesting, Jim. First of all, thank you so much for putting this together and including me, and also for your support for the launch of Ripple, which is really exciting and which has as its basis partnerships, right? It's about partnerships between academia, between policymakers, practitioners, and between the people who actually, in the world that I study, peace building intervention, are actually the consumers of the good. And I want to kind of talk a little bit about how to involve them in this process as well. So I'm going to step back a little bit and then move to some details. There are kind of 3 or 4 broad points that I want to make, all with the caveat that this is extremely stressful, and that part of what we need to do as scholars, as reviewers, as advisors, as teachers, as peers, is to acknowledge and support each other. and maybe share information that we might not already share, right? Part of qualitative research is you usually hold your research tight. Maybe we should begin thinking about ways to share that more, or your data more tightly. So the 4 points I want to make are about escaping your methodological toolbox, about focusing possibly more on theory building, about elite interviews and key informants and how to think about them and how they relate to partnership, and about the ethics of doing fieldwork from afar. And I'll make this quick because I know we have a lot of excellent people in the audience and I want to hear from them as well as Paul. So those who are in the most difficult situation to me are those who are running field experiments or doing ethnography, right? Where there is really no alternative to what they're doing. And so I think there, it's really up to PhD committees and programs to think creatively about what is enough and about whether there can be last minute mixed method, multi-method shifts, using text as data, taking what might have been a field experiment and creating a case study out of it, really thinking about kind of how to do cross-national combined with cases, interviews, archival work. How do we actually address this problem and the fact that some types of research are having to end by actually using mixed methods and thinking about creative ways to combine different methods to actually answer our questions. There are lots of potential options, but what this requires is not that you it requires that you open your methodological and your inferential toolbox, because each of these methods has a different idea of inference and often causality behind it. So that's a challenge that I think is put to a lot of PhD programs and a lot of committees to help their students and enable their students to be more flexible in mixing their methods and in really developing alternative approaches when their research is stuck. I also think this is a real opportunity to take theory development, theory building seriously, right? So scholarly circles are insular. We work with, adopt, and replicate similar theories, but times have changed when the world is changing, say, from a pandemic or from a global racial justice movement. Maybe we need to use those new data from those changes to actually rethink the theories that we are working with and use that as an opportunity to build. Ideally, you build a theory and then test it, but theory building itself is a particular process that requires that you reach outside of your normal set of theories that your discipline tends to work with, often into other disciplines or sub-disciplines. It also requires fundamentally that you adopt a kind of exploratory approach to studying. Rather than saying, I have this precise hypothesis that I am trying to test, I am actually going to engage in a much more exploratory approach, even before I test a hypothesis. This type of work is important at all times, but it may be even more important now. And that brings me to kind of elite interviews, key informants, and partnerships. Because always in my field work, so I lived and worked in Burundi for many years, Congo, Nepal, Sudan, Timor-Leste, all these places, and I always arrive with one set of assumptions, and I always leave saying, oh my God, I had no idea what was actually going on, right? Like the whole point of field work is that you learned something about your phenomena of study that you did not already know. I mean, that is the point of knowledge generation. Let's just say that. The point is to learn what we don't know, right? We hope. But also the process of engaging in fieldwork and engaging in interviews and engaging in interaction is that you are forced to kind of think and understand the phenomena of study in a much more complete way. Of course, you have to develop your sampling strategy and justify it and understand the perspective and bias of each person you speak with. But these elites or key informants are people who know a lot about what you're studying. They are immersed in it in one way or another. And actually, in my experience, it's the key informants, so people who may not be at the top of an organization, but people who work kind of more mid-level, who are the most, who provide me with the best information because they're not set on defending the organization and they don't try to hide things that they don't want me to see. So what I kind of want to talk about is that in this time when what students really need are these connections, in the world that I operate, working with international institutions, NGOs, the UN, rarely, even in a time of pandemic, are people going to kind of just respond to a cold email. And so there's this responsibility for people like me, for other people on the panel, for PhD committees to actually begin to think about serving as brokers, to actually help to connect early career scholars or PhD students with organizations and key informants who can actually help them understand their phenomena of study, actually help them understand the things that they're trying to research. And yet in doing that, it's super important for students and researchers to do their homework. And that doesn't mean read the academic literature, because often the academic literature is hugely detached from the reality that these people live with on a daily basis. It's about doing your research on their reality, which means knowing the policies that they're trying to pursue, knowing all the gray literature that's been written about what they're doing, knowing all of the evaluations, which allows you to go into this discussion and get to something that is not known. It allows you to develop very nuanced questions. It allows you to actually set up a much more engaging key informant elite level experience than you would otherwise have. And related to that, I think that COVID-19 points to a clear need to balance power relationships between researchers in the North and South. And I would push for thinking about real partnerships. So when we get information from people in the field, what is the partnership? I've had, with some of the evaluations I've done for the UN, amazing Burundians who have actually done a lot of the field work or the interviews in Burundi that I could not do, right? So they are partners in that research process. They need to have credit in that process. And I would encourage us to kind of think much more openly about how we give credit, which may require multi-authored publications, right? Where we're encouraged just to have single authored ones. But that in this time where we may have to rely on others and partnerships much more, to think about the power balance there and really giving credit where credit is due. And I'll end just by saying that if ethical research, and I wrote a piece about this a few years ago, but there have been several excellent pieces about the ethics of research, particularly in conflict-affected countries. If it requires that you anticipate the benefit and harm of your research to those who you study, then distance from the quote-unquote field makes it even more difficult to do ethical research. So what do we do about that? How do we actually understand that? And how do we take that into account as we're developing some of these new strategies? And there's a really good piece that 3IE put out about the ethics of doing phone interviews in these contexts that I asked Catherine to send around. So I think they're guides, but these are things that we just need to take seriously. These are challenging times, but research should be about innovation and knowledge generation. So let's support each other in doing that.
Great, thanks so much. Before I turn to Paul, I just want to mention, Jelena, there was a question that came in for you about whether you could provide a link to more information about the task force on online research that you mentioned. So if you do have a link.
The Archival forum exchange?
Yeah, if there's a link for that, if you could put that in the chat box, that would be great. Thank you. And then, so Paul, you know, you are at a university department with a PhD program that produces among the most sought after students on the academic job market. And I'm sure that you have quite a few students who are asking you lots of questions right now about how to proceed. So we thought it would be good if we could all take advantage of your wisdom to ask what kind of advice you're giving your students who are at different stages of their program. And if you could just give us a sense of the kind of questions that they've been asking you, whether they're just starting out their projects or they're trying to complete them.
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for this opportunity. I think a lot of great things have been said. I don't think I have that much more to offer, so I'll try to keep it pretty brief here. So first I wanted to preface it by saying that, you know, this is a really pretty god-awful time in a lot of people's lives. And so I wouldn't want anyone to feel pressure that like they must go do innovative, cool, cutting edge, new kinds of research. Like not getting coronavirus, taking care of kids, helping a partner who's been laid off. Like these are all really important goals. And, you know, I think it's okay to like focus on pressing life events at a time like this. So I hope people won't feel too much pressure to like be doing all kinds of cool, fancy things right now. Because for a lot of people, that's not going to be happening. So kind of keeping our heads above water is as good a goal as any. So just conditional on that. I think there are a lot of issues, right? And I've got some thoughts on kind of the questions that I and, you know, my colleagues at, you know, around the country have been hearing. and some thoughts about ways to try to deal with that, a lot of which overlaps with what previous speakers have said. I was going to be going to India for a field trip this October that's canceled, so that's a bummer. I think a couple issues that have come up are at different stages. One is students who are going on the market. And, I've got a couple great students going on the market. If anybody has jobs out there, like, it would be great if you could hire them. I don't know if anybody in the country has any jobs, but for people who are on the market, I think it's not fun, but it is the case that extending timelines and thinking like there may just be almost no functioning job market this fall. I'm sure there are a few jobs floating around, but compared to normal years. And so just accepting, like, not expecting a job, not taking it as a market failure that you didn't get a job this time around, just kind of treating it almost as like an experimental foray in a time of dystopia, I think is probably the healthiest way to approach it, because there are a ton of people who will be trying to get jobs. There will be very few of them. And I think we all just need to kind of accept that and make a norm both around professional employment and kind of what it looks like in this time, and also productivity, that like there will just be gaps in 2020, 2021 in people's CVs, and kind of building a norm that like that's just what happened when the pandemic hit, I think is important. In thinking about extending timelines, some of that comes into applying for postdocs, some of it comes into looking into funding within one's own department, and kind of what are options if things are just looking like, you need to stick around another year. So that's some very blunt advice or conversations that I've had with some people, and certainly others, I'm sure, are having those. Earlier on in the process, right, a lot of conversations, and also there have been conversations about what non-academic employment looks as well, though I encourage those in general, pandemic or not. But that's something maybe if people are interested, we can talk about in Q&A. Earlier on in the process, I think, it's a matter of personal taste. I personally like to think through worst case scenarios and like, what would I do if? And so thinking about like, if things don't get to normal anytime soon, like what would a plan B dissertation look like if absolutely necessary? Some people will find that more stressful. So again, it's a matter of personal taste. For me, myself, I'm like, okay, what's the worst that can happen? And then what are ways that, one can adapt to that, I think could be helpful. Much less dramatically though, I think there are a few kind of ideas that have come up as I've been thinking about this. One is really mundane, but it's actually taking this time to read up on the literature. I don't know about other people, but I have like a kind of a triage mentality. Just like, oh, what's been written on this? All right, let me get kind of roughly up to speed and then move on, right? And often I, both in grad school and since, like I miss things or they're really cool ideas that I don't really engage with because I view it as like, I just need to get through this and get on to the next thing. I think now is an interesting time. Like there is no next thing, or maybe there isn't a next thing that you can actually do. So kind of reading more broadly, kind of getting up to speed, figuring out where real existing holes and gaps are, doing justice to what people have done previously. These are all areas that can trigger new research ideas, helpful new framing. So it's really mundane. It sounds silly, but I think it actually, in a weird way, this can be a good time to kind of invest in that, thinking about it as like kind of an investment in making better work down the road. Similarly mundane, but go back to old papers, especially for graduate students, seminar papers that maybe were left to die on a hard drive, or I guess now a cloud drive or whatever. Going back and see, is there something I could do with this, right? Maybe there was something here 2 years later, now I know more about the field, I know, methodological ways of dealing with it or a new spin on it. And so some people do have time, right? And so it's now is a useful time to go to something and say, well, I can't go to the field, I can't do this, run this survey I was going to. Could I try to get a working paper out of this, or a journal article under submission, right? So these are both like really minor, mundane suggestions, but I think they could have some actual like real value added, especially given the temptation in a normal time to just like move on to the cool next thing, right? Now, I had a set of other suggestions for kind of data collection beyond fieldwork that have already been mentioned, but like Zoom interviews, online and in-person databases, archives, collections of documents, I find really helpful. Like libraries will often just have a big collection of documents. A lot of these are online as well. And so there are ways of getting even primary sources that maybe, historians have used before, but you haven't, to kind of talk to some of the previous issues, suggestions. Hiring an RA long distance is something as well. You want to be careful about the ethics of this and kind of making sure COVID's okay in their context, making sure you're paying them, enough and have appropriate expectations. But certainly, I do research in and on India, and this is something that people do. And then there are these creative sources of data. So for instance, I just managed to put together a little data set of Indian Army combat fatalities based on websites that were created for Army Day celebrations. So these are like not, this is not really what the Indian Army is expecting this data to be used for, but with a little kind of wandering around and poking and prying, I've been able to find all kinds of interesting stuff just on the internet. And there, social media is another place where people can find kind of angles or pieces of data and ways of thinking about things that, maybe are not in of themselves sufficient for the dissertation, but allow you to kind of continue moving in the right direction. So those are a few, I think a lot of these have already been said, but kind of some both big picture and smaller picture thoughts for how people can kind of handle this, really trying and very stressful time.
Great. Well, thank you all so much, and look forward to seeing any questions or comments from folks who are attending this session. I did want to mention also on Paul's point about the job market that we don't expect a robust market. I was pleased to see that Cornell posted an assistant professor position today, so that was a good sign. Anytime I see a position, there are a number of positions that are being posted outside the United States where it seems like the market may in fact be better. So that's something to look toward. But also wanted to mention that we're going to keep doing some webinars throughout the fall, and we will do one probably in October on non-academic positions and try to bring together a panel of folks who have PhDs who have pursued non-academic options. And, certainly there are people who've done PhDs who've gone on and had careers outside of academia. One of the questions I think will arise now is, can you pursue a non-academic position and do something outside of academia for a while with an eye toward hoping that you could come into academia later? And I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that, that particular question, if they'd like to respond to that. I typically we've thought about people doing academic or non-academic careers, but not, I'm going to do non-academic for a while I'm waiting for the market to rebound. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that.
I mean, I'm happy to defer to others. My sense is it's harder to get back into disciplinary departments and probably easier to get into kind of policy schools or interdisciplinary programs. I could be wrong about that, but I think, disciplinary departments are very old school and kind of boring. And like, there's, you do your PhD and then maybe you do a postdoc, then you start teaching and, so I think it really depends on the kind of job in terms of just how doable it is to jump back in.
This is something that Jim and I had like a Twitter exchange about, but if that's the case, what Paul is saying, and I fully, that's my instinct as well. What does that mean about the types of scholars who get to stay in our profession, right? So if I'm doing survey experiments or, I can just FOIA request, reams upon reams of documents from Congress or whatever it is, right? I kind of worry about the sociological imagination of our field if there is going to be this rigidity when folks who are doing IR and especially comparative, right, just simply cannot gain access to the resources that they need, or at least the best quality of resources that would allow them to best present themselves as scholars, to be, submitting things for review, to have materials for articles and book manuscripts, etc. I don't know, that just like really worries me in terms of like who will be left and what that means also then for training of undergraduates and graduate students. So if this like new set of whatever the opposite of like patient zero is, like where like you're the ones who survive, right? It's like if that skews, quantitative methods, let's say, then who's going to train people to do field research, right? I mean, BTG can definitely get us part of the way there. Bridging the Gap can. But yeah, this is just something that's worrying. And we were already, I think, probably more quantity than I think is good. But yeah, Jelena.
Yeah, but yeah, go ahead, Jelena, and then I have one comment, and then I have something I wanted to ask Susanna and Katie in this regard.
Yeah, I just briefly wanted to respond to this. So yeah, I mean, as somebody who is 100% qualitative, I totally get that, and I've been fighting the good fight against the hegemony of quantitative methods in especially American academia all my life. But I will say that even though I think you're right in the sense that this might produce more quantitative work, it also might open up much more space for theoretical work. And so there's this whole other thing that I think the ethnographic qualitative work in the middle might suffer in the short term. You're right for the reasons that we indicate. Although, I mean, the point of this session today was to talk about how not to have it drop off and how to continue to do kind of virtual fieldwork and virtual ethnography to the extent possible. But I also think this could be a really good opportunity for people to write, theoretical pieces, which I think would benefit us all.
So that definitely was a point of this. I think it's important that we do emphasize Paul's point that a good part of this was also designed to just help people think about how to cope with the situation that they're in, and even if the advertisement didn't talk about enough about the mutual supportive aspect of this, just in all aspects, I think that's really important. I just want to make a comment on this issue of policy schools versus departments, which is that, I mean, the good news is there are just more and more policy schools and policy programs. I mean, it's sort of the explosion's pretty extraordinary if you look out back over the last couple of decades, and these kind of schools are popping up all over. And what's interesting is that unlike those schools maybe 20 or 30 years ago, those schools are actually looking for, the same sort of kinds of political scientists that departments are looking for in terms of the, work that is valued by the discipline as opposed to entirely practitioner-based type of work. And it's interesting. Mike Desch and I have a piece that we do have to finish up. We have an R&R at International Studies Perspectives. We did a survey of deans of schools of international affairs and the chairs of the top 50 political science departments, and asked them a whole set of questions about their expectations with respect to faculty research. And what you find is that the departments care about the things that you would expect them to care about. Particular difference there is really way more interest in methods than the policy schools. Policy schools, much more interest in area studies than the departments. You would expect that. But clear that in terms of sort of getting hired, getting tenured, getting promoted, it's not that different being a scholar in a policy school than it is being a scholar in a disciplinary department. What we did find was the deans of the international affairs schools had all these other things they were hoping their faculty members would do as well. And one of our conclusions is that the faculty assistant professors at international affairs schools must be very busy indeed, given that their deans are interested in things that the political science department chairs don't care about in terms of sort of, the non-academic work. But Kelly, your point is key, which is if you've got people going into these policy schools doing a certain type of work, if you have, I know this is also true in the field of diplomatic history, where a lot of the policy schools have picked up the slack and hired diplomatic historians, but where then, who's going to be training the PhD students? Because typically you don't have the same kind of large PhD programs. I mentioned Katie and Susanna before because they both got their PhDs at policy schools, but curious if they have any thoughts in that regard on sort of the difference and sort of how that may manifest. I know it's a little off our main topic, but it came up, and so I think it's worth mentioning.
Katie, do you want to take it first and then I'll go?
Happy to. But Jim, is the question what were our experiences as qualitative researchers in policy schools versus departments of political science?
Well, I think the question really is sort of what kind of work is getting valued, and how should that factor into the kinds of thinking that students, PhD students, are doing with whatever expectations they might have. I partly sort of was trying to get at what kind of expectations should they have about academic careers if they are thinking, well, I'm not sure what I want to teach in a political science department, what I want to teach at a policy school. I mainly really just want to get a job. I think that's probably the first and most important thing. But if they have thoughts in that regard, are we thinking, I'm just trying to think about what the differences might be. And again, you know, with respect to the survey that Desh and I did, I don't think there are some differences in expectations, but most of the differences in expectations are actually about what people are doing when they're not publishing in peer-reviewed journals and university press books, basically.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that clarification, Jim. So based on my experience, both at Duke, which is where I did my training, but also in the Stanford School of Public Policy, but also with my experience at IU, where I have my feet in different interdisciplinary, policy-oriented departments. And based on also my participation in Bridging the Gap programs, where I've heard from other scholars in policy schools, but also heard from the policymaking community, my own sense is that deep qualitative research, deep knowledge of field sites, the knowledge and understanding of social phenomena that stem from ethnographic research is highly valued in the schools and in the policymaking community, where often policymakers have less time than ethnographers or qualitative researchers to spend actually embedded in the field. So to the extent that policy schools are looking for faculty, and my experience is that they are, looking for faculty who are top-notch disciplinary scholars who have strong methodological trainings, but who also, in addition, can speak to or are asking policy-relevant questions and writing in policy-relevant ways. My sense is that qualitative research is highly, highly valued, both, again, within policy schools and policymaking communities. Susanna, I welcome your perspective on this as well, particularly having spent quite a bit of time, if I understand correctly, in policymaking communities.
Yeah, any brief thoughts? And then there are a couple questions I wanted to get to from attendees. So
great, and I'll address Naz's question as well here.
Okay.
So
in
my response, so she says, at least a couple of you have long consulted for various IOs and INGOs. What do you think of are the pros or cons for doctoral students of trying to work on some side projects with such organizations, both to broaden their research portfolios, but also to buy time and secure financial resources in an insecure time? So what I would love to see is a normative shift. And how do we get there? We get first movers, right? We get people, both academics on hiring committees, deans, people who write letters, who see engagement in the policy world, not just as, you know, an international affairs fellow for 1 year, but possibly actually having a job in the policy world as something that is an asset, not a liability. I don't think we're there yet. It's never been my experience in academia that, so I did my undergrad, then I went and worked for 8 years, and then I went back and did my master's. But I worked for the Council on Foreign Relations. I worked for UNICEF. I worked for the UN. I worked for International Crisis Group in war zones on the things that I ended up doing my research. So for me, this was absolutely foundational in my understanding of what I was studying and in my ability to actually define problems and develop theories and actually identify puzzles. I don't think that, and then I went into academia via a policy school degree from the Fletcher School. This is not the easy path. It is not one that I would recommend. How I ended up here is also a lot of luck. So I think that that's really important to convey, that people are taking risks. And yet, if we could stop now and say, yes, go work for an IO or an INGO or USAID for a year, gain that experience. You will learn so much and we'll take you back. That would be such an important signal to help people get through this time, right? And also, they may be able to, in some ways, get access to more data, to new questions, to develop new research in that way. If we can open that up, and that requires signaling from elites in academia, then I think we could help students get through this time a lot. So I don't want to take too much time, but I think that's extremely important. One thing on Naz framed this as a side job. My experience is it's never a side job, right? That it's kind of a job in order to do an evaluation or whatever you're doing. It is your job, and you have to figure out how to make that evaluation, that research, whatever it is, become an academic publication, because there are no shortcuts. That's it for me.
That's great, thanks. So I wanted to move on to Sheena Greeton's question, which is, the kind of disruptions we've been talking about are disruption when you can't go places. Her point is there's also this disruption in terms of time, and people don't necessarily have as much time to do research as they did before because they have other things going on in their lives. And that can, we've seen a lot of that, of course, with respect to care, child care issues, but there can be other things, it could be person's health disruption, could be elder care, could be all sorts of issues that the pandemic has disrupted, leaving you less time for the research. And so any thoughts about that issue to help scholars think about how to work through projects? Paul, is that a hand there? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any great solution to it. I think it's actually really important for senior people to kind of establish a norm that this was a very unusual year and our research expectations should not be the same for it, rather than oh, well, you just need to be creative and work an extra 8 hours in addition to homeschooling your children. I think that's just not an appropriate, way for us to be thinking about it. And so very publicly and vocally kind of signaling that this should not, when we're reading a CV or, writing letters or whatever, that this should not be seen as just a normal time. And we shouldn't be oh, I wonder what happened to this person's productivity in 2021. There's a gap there. It's well, maybe the year before the person's, father died from COVID, or they were homeschooling kids for 8 months or something. I don't have great suggestions beyond that, to be honest. There's no way to give you back time without basically saying work extra hard, which I think is not really a fair expectation at this point. But that's kind of my sense of what more senior people can do to kind of set expectations.
Jelena, you had something?
Yeah, I have something incredibly not well thought out, but a couple of things. So I am incredibly lucky in the sense that I have very few caregiving responsibilities. I have one son who's 13 and he kind of runs on autopilot. I kind of don't know what he does all day, I'm leading to the fact that I'm an incredibly imperfect parent. And so my advice to everybody is that, being kind of an imperfect parent and imperfect spouse and imperfect scholar at the time, in a time of pandemic, is totally fine. So, I mean, I think I kind of wish I could convey to many people who are so stressed out, if they can relieve some of the pressure that they put on themselves. I really would want that. If not every meal has to be made from scratch, microwaving pizza's fine. I'm seeing people do very, very elaborate online teaching. They're making studios in their own houses. It's not going to be perfect, but maybe make your class just be good enough for now. And I feel really strongly that, echoing Paul, this idea that we have to do everything, all of our roles have to be perfect at all time is not true in the best of times, and it's certainly not true now. So I think just kind of, measuring your expectations in all areas of your life to make it just good enough for now, I think is what I would advise.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Kelly, and then, so Kelly, if you're going to respond to that, I want to throw another question in as well that came on that you might be able to answer, and that's Saskia Breckenmacher, that's the question is, what criteria should we use to evaluate when it's safe and ethical to do in-person field research again? Sort of going, you know, not just following official travel rules, but really thinking about, you know, how to be responsible in doing that kind of research again.
Yeah, so yeah, let's go for both of those. So just piggybacking off of Paul's points and also Jelena's points, I think, yeah, making some adjustments is important. One adjustment is potentially putting on pause some solo projects and co-authoring. I find that I'm much more encouraged and energized to do work where I have, you know, a colleague who is relying on me to pass the baton to them at a particular time. But even then, having like major adjustments to like how many hours one is working in a given day. And so for me, it's been 5 hours or 500 words, whichever comes first. And so if I crank it out in like 2 hours, like the day is mine, I'm going to go on a hike. And so just figuring out ways to be flexible and gentle with oneself and to, you know, prioritize mental health and spending time with family and loved ones. Onto this point about when it will be safe to conduct research again. For me, I would say a few months after vaccines have been in wide distribution, because, you know, one concern that folks have been talking about is the efficacy of a particular vaccine. So just because you're taking it does not mean you're good to go, right? And just because you might have a defense, even if it is efficacious, which again, we would need more time to tell long-term efficacy. You know, you can still be a disease vector for people in other places where maybe vaccines are slower to be mass produced and distributed. So I think not only, you know, feeling like you're good to go, but also being very mindful of the folks you would be coming into contact with. And again, emphasizing that north-south dimension and not wanting to, you know, bring illness and hardship to people who are somewhere else. Kind of like wearing a mask, right? It's mostly for the other person. You know, there are protections for you, but I think, yeah, so I don't know, does that mean 3 months? Does that mean 6 months to actually see how the rollout happens and, you know, how long, like the extent to which it actually protects people who have vaccines? Yeah, I think that's kind of an open question, but I would err towards farther into the future from whenever, you know, not just like, okay, I got my shot, I'm on my way to Richmond Airport, right? Definitely not that.
Katie, I see you have a point, and so also if you want to talk about that, and then there's a question from Summer Lindsay that I think you could also answer, and Susanna, you as well. How should grant applications be changing to accommodate the pandemic situation? Do you see different opportunities, and would you advise PhD students to be submitting fieldwork heavy NSF dissertation fellowship proposals?
Thanks, Jim. On Saskia's question, I just wanted to add to one quick point to Kelly's excellent points, which is also taking cues from folks on the ground to the extent that we already have contacts there. Asking them when they feel comfortable having us come back, I think is key. Again, if we already have contacts there. As for grant applications, I've not applied to NSF, so I'm not sure about that specifically. I can't speak to NSF. I am advising my own doctoral students, and I am still applying for grants that are fieldwork heavy, but not projecting being able to be in the field before a year from now. But also, of course, having contingency plans in place in the grant in case even a year from now is still impossible.
Yeah, I'm doing the same. So I'm churning out as many grant applications as I can, trying to actually in some ways pursue some of these new ideas, and also based on partnerships. So looking at kind of taking this partnership idea seriously, because I think for me, if I'm going to engage in partnerships, say with universities in a lot of the countries that I study, then what I can bring to the table is money, right? And so what is that then? Then I should do the grant application, even if I might not be, or my PhD student might not be the one actually doing the research. So I think thinking creatively about this is very important, and it opens up opportunities for us to take these partnerships much more seriously. But yes, do the applications. You have to keep moving. Nobody knows what's going to happen. This is all about risk. Applications ask you to take risk into account. So take it into account and provide alternative plans and actually assess the risk. Funders still have to give their money out, right? So this machine needs to keep going. So let's help it to keep going. Sarah Parkinson posted these SSRC items that she's been working on, and she's done a ton of work on field work. So it's ARC, I believe, is the organization with Kanisha and Millie and Sarah that they run. So for ethics of field work in conflict affected zones, they've been trying to deal with this, or in difficult contexts. So look there as well. And I just want to respond to Lucy Maycock's point here, which is she's trying to do online interviews with people with whom she doesn't actually have a rapport. And I think this is where these kind of brokers that I was talking about, Lucy, I think become important. Even if you can find one person among them, or even a few, and you can actually establish a relationship with them, then they can help you create legitimacy, or at least vouch for you with others. And so thinking about not having to do all the work yourself of building those relationships each time, but maybe investing in a few, or working with people who you feel like can help to vouch for you, and giving them something to vouch for in the process. But realizing, and even in how you write up your research, being honest about how this particular modality might influence your findings. I think although there are distances created through online conversations, there can also be an intimacy that may not be possible when you're face to face. So looking through and really assessing, kind of doing your meta-analysis of that research process should be part of what you're producing when you're using it.
There are two questions. I'm going to read both of them out, and if people can respond to one or the other, or both if you want. Dean Rowan says, I'm listening not as a researcher per se, but from an academic research library. What can libraries be doing for researchers now during the pandemic, but also in ordinary times? And curious whether researchers aren't asking enough of their libraries, asking enough questions, things that the libraries might be able to help them with that they don't think about asking them. And then Jelena, Naz was responding to your points about the disruptions to various parts of your life, and asking whether folks as either doctoral candidates or junior colleagues for job market statements or tenure files, should they be recording the myriad ways in which their lives are being disrupted, and hence their productivity is being affected in what Paul called the time of dysphoria.
Okay, I'll take the second quickly. I mean, I think this would have to depend on your institution. I feel reluctant giving advice to people how to document things in preparation for promotion that may not work at their institution. I think a lot of these questions that we are hearing about, what should grant agencies do and what should administrators do, it should be questions for them, not for individual researchers. Unfortunately, when we are kind of, often at the mercy of very rigid institutional structures. But I think to the extent that senior scholars or professional organizations can have a unified message that this is not a normal time and expectations of research should be adjusted in more ways than just giving people an extra year. So for example, my institution, and I'm sure many others on the call, have given junior or any faculty really an opportunity to have like a break year and go up for tenure a year later. And that's fine to a certain extent, but that's not really enough, I think, because a lot of the times, as you all know, research takes more than a year, and the missed field work or the missed research or the missed connections, the missed collaborations can extend way, longer into the future than a year. So I think it's on us to the extent that we can pressure institutions to really have a much more realistic way of not only measuring time of research, but also, quantity of what is possible. So that's a long answer to a question that I'm not sure I would recommend that everybody just documents, how many hours they spent homeschooling their kids. I don't think we want to go there. I don't think it should be on us. I think it should be on institutions to readjust their policies about what constitutes acceptable research for promotion.
Yeah, and I just really want to emphasize this because it's something I've been just hugely concerned about over the last half year. And just that's the compounding nature of the differences for people as they go along. I mean, it was great that schools responded in the spring and said, oh, we'll give you an extra year before you have to come up. But as you say, Jelena, I mean, that's just not, I mean, the differences will compound over time, and that includes, you come up later. I mean, there will be salary increases down the road. There will be merit increases. There will be bumps for tenure and promotion. Well, if you do that later, the bump is later. And that compounds over time, and salary differentials are going to grow. There are all sorts of differences that are going to become magnified over time, and institutions are going to have to manage that. So we had those two questions, and with the time remaining, I think what I want to do is just go around, and if you want to respond to either of those or any final comments, and I'm just going to go in order of how you're appearing on my screen. So Katie, Jelena, you just responded, and so if you have anything else, that's fine. But I'm going to go Katie, Paul, Kelly, Susanna, and then Jelena if you have anything else. But Katie.
Final comments, I'll just reiterate two things, which is, actually they're I think directly related, which is taking cues whenever possible from our partners in the field, looking to them to guide us, and doing our very best to stay true to the research and to our partners, and working and supporting each other as we find creative ways to navigate the pressures of academic life at whatever stage we are. I'll just stop there.
Great. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, on the library's point, I don't know. I think libraries could do, I have an amazing library here. They do all kinds of cool stuff. So maybe just kind of like signaling to faculty, like any question, shoot it our way and we'll see what we can do. I don't have more specific advice than that. I think this question of like signaling disruption, I don't know how to answer that. It feels very uncomfortable for me to recommend or set some expectation that people tell us what happened to them, because some may not want to do it, right, for very understandable reasons. Others may feel pressure to do it or feel disadvantaged. It's like, there are just all these perverse, like second and third order effects that I really feel very uncomfortable about. But I also acknowledge that there have been huge disruptions. So I think this idea of kind of a norm of presumptive generosity, putting pressure on institutions, trying to find ways to help students who've been affected, I think that's better than being like, well, on your cover letter, tell us the 7 ways that you've been affected, and we'll see if those are worse than the 7 other ways that other applicant has been affected. Like that's no way to go. So I think kind of setting expectations and norms is to be the most productive thing, rather than putting it on graduate students to tell us how they've suffered more than other people, which, will not end well.
Great, thanks. Kelly?
Yeah, just closing, I recall something one of my committee members, actually a couple of my committee members told me this spring, I think in March or April, was, the most important thing is you getting out of this season with your mental and physical health, which can be jarring to get from academic mentors as a type of feedback, but it's like, is this a trick? You want me to take care of myself, but publish or perish, they say. Hey, publish and perish. Somebody posted that on Twitter. It's like the most 2020 thing. So that like people say publish or perish, but we might just publish and perish nevertheless. Anyways, that was dark. Wow, that's not me at all. See what COVID has done to me? Yeah, if it's a year from now, which would be my guess, like at best, right? Like being, in person and, going to class and all of that with our students. If that's 1 year from now, and we have been in this for 6 months, so just imagine the last 6 months, doubled, plus, I don't know, like interest of stress, basically, that maybe compounds daily or weekly, I don't know. And so making sure that, we pace ourselves so that we have the energy to get back to all of these things at maybe not the same pace as before, but at a higher intensity, when we are more able to freely move and travel. So there are definitely some energy stores that I think we should also be building up during this time, both because there's still a very long road ahead of us, and also so that, we're not so burnt out that by the time that opportunities are reopening, we don't actually have, the mental or physical bandwidth and capacity to make the most of those. So just taking care of ourselves and our people, whomever they may be.
Great, thank you, Susanna.
Yeah, I mean, that's it, right? So it is about taking care of ourselves and our people, as Kelly says. And what I would love to see is, I would love to see a kind of slight shift in academic culture around this. This is a highly competitive field where credit is not always given where credit is due, where people are pushed down. And let's see if in this time we can actually shift that, and what it looks like to actually create communities of support, maybe for people who don't naturally have them because of where they went to grad school or the environment that they're operating in. And so I think that's the work that each of us has to do, to think about how we can reach out and support others and have a bit of a more compassionate approach to this industry that relies on our kind of analytical prowess, but maybe needs a little bit of a softer touch. So I think that's incumbent on us all. And I would love to see, I think, Jem, I think you and BTG have filled a really important role here in actually enabling discussions that are not otherwise happening. But I would love to see some broader statements from whatever level in academia is appropriate, where we kind of talk not just about extending clocks, but talk about what this means for the academy and what kind of normative shifts people are really committed to. Thanks again.
Thank you. Jelena, did you have anything you wanted to add? Okay. Well, this has been a remarkable discussion. I'm so appreciative to all of you. I'm so appreciative to the folks who joined, whether you asked a question or not. And I hope this has been useful to you. And we will have the recording up, and I think it's something that people can really make great use of. And I'm really pleased about that, to be able to contribute in any way we can. It's wonderful that the 5 of you have given your time this afternoon and your insights. And I would just say that I think, coming back to Kelly's last points, that this is a time to be kind to yourself, and it is a time to be kind to others. And, social media, I think we can use social media in a beneficial way. People have questions, responses. I field a lot of questions on social media. A lot of people message me that I think wouldn't message me otherwise. And I think being able to be helpful is important. And not being kind is not good on social media. And we have seen that in recent days in our field. And so I think let's just remember, be kind to ourselves and be kind to each other. And thanks to Catherine Urban for setting this all up, and wishing you all good health and ability to handle all the stress and anxiety of this coming year. Good luck to everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jim.